Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, evening, or whenever you might be watching us in replay. And I will say tonight's episode is being recorded if you'd like to watch it again later. Welcome to today's Sunshine Week webinar, hosted by the Student Press Law Center. I'm Mike Heaston. I'm SPLC Senior Legal Counsel. For those of you who maybe haven't heard about the Student Press Law Center before, just a real quick sort of intro. We're a nonprofit organization. We were founded 50 years ago, this year actually. And our whole reason for being in business is to promote, support, and defend the rights of high school and college student journalists. My specific job at the center is to kind of manage our free legal hotline. So our website is absolutely chock full of all sorts of legal resources. You can kind of DIY it if you want, but if you'd like to set up a telephone call or send me an email on any sort of media law topic, we're going to talk today about covering sexual assault cases. And so we'll get into like freedom of information topics and things like that. But we do all sorts of media law topics, so libel and censorship and copyright. Yeah, please do use our services when you need them. So we're happy to have you here tonight as we dive into a topic that has landed squarely on many of the student journalists that I work with, reporting on sexual abuse and harassment issues, or Me Too reporting in schools. As I tell everyone, this is advanced level journalism, and particularly since the rise of the Me Too movement, helping student media uncover and then safely and legally report on these stories has certainly changed my professional life. I'm always looking for tips and guides to help all of us do this work better. And I'm honored and delighted to have an exceptional journalist with us tonight who's going to lead our discussion. Joining us is Matt Drange, an award-winning investigative reporter whose work has made a significant impact in this field. He is currently a reporter based out of Business Insider's San Francisco bureau. Matt previously covered money and power in Silicon Valley for The Information, Forbes magazine, and the Center for Investigative Reporting. His work has been published by ProPublica, The Guardian, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Pacific Standard, and I'm sure lots of other places. He graduated with a journalism degree from Cal Poly Humboldt. He holds a master's degree from Columbia's Journalism School and teaches journalism at Oakland's Laney College and Cal Poly Humboldt. Matt will share his firsthand insights, experiences, and practical advice on how student journalists can cover sensitive topics like Me Too, including, I think, his incredible story about what he found at his former high school. Please join me in welcoming Matt Drange. Matt, thank you for joining us here during Sunshine Week.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Mike, and hi everybody. Thanks for stopping by. I'm excited to speak with you all today. Um, so I think I'm gonna show you some slides. I know I can't see the folks in the room, but I'm gonna show some slides here that will hopefully kind of guide the conversation. But I wanted to flag up front, if you have questions, please don't feel like you have to save them all for the end. Mike and Josh are gonna help me kind of keep an eye on the chat. So would love to help shape this as much as I can to the needs of the folks in the room and what you're most interested in and hoping to get out of this. Unfortunately, we could talk about this for many hours. We're trying to keep this to about an hour. So if there are things in particular that you really want to know about, or you really want me to talk a little bit about, please do raise your hand and or fire away in the chat. So I'll go ahead and start showing some slides here. Right. Um, so this is, whoops. All right. As Mike mentioned, I've reported for several years now on sexual abuse in schools. My focus personally has been on K-12 educator on student abuse. There's a whole universe of sexual misconduct and abuse involving student on student, and of course also above K-12, college, graduate school, and below as well. So what I'm going to talk about is focused on K-12, but there are certainly, I think, a lot of elements and approaches that would apply to other educational institutions as well. I'm a business reporter. I didn't set out to kind of spend years on this topic to be in a position to give a talk like this. And so I don't know if any of you in the room are education reporters. I assume maybe some of you are. And if you're not, I guess I'm here to tell you, you can do this. It is really challenging, and we'll talk about why that is, why so much of this behavior is really secret by design, um, and how you can overcome that. But you certainly don't need to be an expert if you're coming to this cold. That is perfectly fine. That's exactly how I came to it. So I'm going to talk mostly about this story here. It's called the Predator's Playground, and it was a story that we published here at Business Insider about a year and a half ago now. And it's a deep dive into one high school, my high school actually. And so I think it's a nice framework to sort of think about and conceptualize how to approach a story like this. So I'm going to mostly speak about this story, but I've reported on this issue at schools across the country, and this series of stories got started actually with an article that I did about my own high school journalism teacher. Um, so let's see if there's any other housekeeping. I think I want to flag too, um, this kind of reporting is not for everyone. It's really difficult. It's obviously very heavy. Sexual abuse is its own universe of reporting, and child sexual abuse in particular is probably the most difficult kind of Me Too reporting you can do, for a lot of reasons that we'll talk about a little bit. But it's certainly not for everyone. That said, I hope that at least for a couple of you, if you're considering pursuing a story in this realm, um, or have thought about maybe doing a story like that in the future, that you can leave feeling at least the knowledge that this reporting is incredibly important. And the primary reason is that this kind of abuse, we'll talk about again this one story here in a second, but this kind of abuse is incredibly common. The best estimates we have in the United States, at least, for educator on student sexual abuse suggest that 1 in 10 people are targeted for grooming, sexual grooming, at some point in their K-12 career. So 1 in 10. Um, that means that I can almost guarantee you, if you start digging into pick any school that you might cover or want to cover, you will probably find allegations of this type. That might sound a little alarmist, a little hard to believe. If you had told me that a few years ago, I would have found that hard to believe. But that's the reality that we live in. And so, um, again, it's not for everyone. But if you do decide that you want to dive into this, there's a huge need for it. So I think let me just jump ahead here. So, last thing, and we'll dive in, but again, we're gonna try to keep this to about an hour, so about 50 minutes. But if you want to know more about how I did some of these stories after today, check out a couple of these articles. The one on the left is a Q&A that I did a couple years ago with Jesse Sposato about just sort of the process and some of the in the weeds parts of how the reporting was done. And then the clip on the right is a interview with KQED here in the Bay Area that I did with Sasha Koka that gets into some of that, as well as some of the emotional weight and discomfort from being so close to a story. As I said, this reporting for me kicked off with the story I did on my high school journalism teacher. All right, so starting out. So again, I'm presuming that you're coming to this cold or thinking about diving in. A story like this can start a lot of different ways, like any story, right? I just heard from somebody today, a reporter in Texas today, actually, who got a tip about a story. That is a perfectly fine way to dive in, and we'll talk about ways that you can sort of start with that and leverage that. In my case, it was just a hunch. I had a hunch that there would be people like this at my high school, simply because, as an alumni, knowing the culture of the school and sort of the blurred boundaries between students and teachers, it was really just a hunch. Um, So who can you talk with? This is a huge one. I mean, I tell my students, I teach an investigative reporting class, and I tell them to think of the subject of what they're reporting on as a castle, right? Picture a castle, it's got tall walls, right? Who is on the outside of this castle? In this case, this castle is a school, right? Who's on the outside of it? So your parents, um, particularly involved parents, PTA, for example, parents who gather on social media. You have alumni. In my case, alumni were a huge part of the pool of sources that I spoke with. I interviewed, I think I've lost count this way, over 350 people. And I would say probably at least a third of those people were alumni. Um, and probably at least another third were employees, current and former. Um, and so again, keeping that analogy of the castle in your mind, starting out, if I had zero sources and I wanted to report on a tip that I got, I would look to social media, see, if I could identify some sources that way, people who gather who might have heard of stories. Often with students today, one of the big differences from say 10, certainly 20 years ago, right, of course, is that students are much more online today, and so in many cases, not so much in my reporting, but in many cases that I'm familiar with that get reported on, they actually start with a tip from a survivor, a victim, who might disclose, perhaps very directly, very bluntly, perhaps indirectly, something that happened to them. So social media can be a huge resource. Of course, it can be hard to mine, right? And obviously, a lot of it can be private or semi-private, but just want to emphasize that that can be a huge one for me. I think Facebook and Instagram in particular were super helpful. Um, what records can you get? So Mike kind of alluded to this at the top, but and I'll talk about this, mostly in the context of public schools. Private schools, of course, you are entitled, at least under the law, to less records. That doesn't mean you can't request them. It just means it might be harder to get. And I'll show you a template of the request I use, the actual language. But what types of records can you get? What can you get? I would focus on teacher disciplinary records, for the most part, which where I am in California, are considered, in part public. A lot of school districts may not know that, may pretend they don't know that. There can be a lot of challenges with, exerting your right under the law, but at least from a legal standpoint, portions of a teacher's personnel file are public in California and dozens of other states. I requested, as part of this series, records from more than 500 school districts across the country, so the 10 largest in every state, plus a bunch of others that I got tips about. And I received records in the end from about 35 to 40 of them, states that is. So most states, records are gettable, and in other states, records were likely gettable, but I either didn't have the resources, the legal help, or the time to get them. Um, and then, what breadcrumbs might have been made public already. So I mentioned this, but social media is a great place. I'm using the word breadcrumbs pretty deliberately too, because that's what researchers describe as the most common evidence of grooming. So when I say grooming, a teacher grooming a child for a sexual relationship, typically, it doesn't start with sex, right? It starts with giving a child gifts, giving the child ride home, being particularly affectionate with the child, hugging a child if it's a young child in class. Things that you might see, and in some cases maybe you don't think anything of it. Things that may violate district policy, but there would be nothing against the law about. A lot of gray area, essentially. And so that's what makes this reporting particularly tricky, I think, is that it's very, very rare that, a would-be source of yours, so an employee or another student, is going to actually see a teacher and a student having a sexual relationship, right? That's not that common. It does happen, obviously, but much more common are these breadcrumbs. And so you have to really pay close attention to them in your reporting. When you're interviewing folks about what did you see? Okay, you didn't see them kissing, but did you see them talking one on one? Did you see the student in the teacher's classroom often one on one with the door closed? What did you see? Because those types of breadcrumbs are often where the reporting can start. Um, so I mentioned the template, request template. Here's a version of one that I use. This is two parts. You can see obviously it's very dense. It's very legalese. That's because I wrote it with the help of several lawyers. Going back to the castle analogy, right? Like, who is on the outside of the castle? Well, attorneys who represent um, families who represent other journalists in some cases are another group of stakeholder outside of those castle walls. And so I got help from a number of attorneys who had successfully fought for the release of documents from school districts, and I borrowed the language and tweaked things, made it my own. But this is the language that I use to great success. It was more successful in some states than others. So here in California, um, this language 10 out of 10 worked for me every time. In other states, Alabama, um, Louisiana, states that have weaker public records laws, this language was less successful. But even in cases where you get denied, one thing, particularly if you're reporting on this at any kind of scale, so maybe it's district wide, you're looking at maybe it's statewide if you work for, a larger media outlet. Um, if you can get documents from one district, it can be hugely, hugely helpful to then leverage those documents to get documents from other districts, right? Sort of that peer pressure. So when I got documents from a school district in a state where I kept getting denied and denied and denied, as soon as I got records from one, I would follow up with the other, seven, eight, nine school districts that had denied my request previously and say, hey, you know, school district down the highway gave me records. I'm gonna say in my story that you didn't and they did. Do you want me to say that, or do you want to maybe reconsider my request? And that could be a really powerful thing, particularly with a story like this, right? Optics are huge in reporting, as I think probably a lot of you know if you've been doing this for any amount of time. And often when I'm like, let's say I'm in my business reporting zone, right? And I'm getting budget documents, emails, things like that. Typically, the kinds of public records I work with, the optics aren't as black and white in my favor as the requester. With this set of records, though, with teacher disciplinary records that have to do with student safety in particular, the optics are very much in your favor as a requester. And so it's less about need to know the law, what you're entitled to, what the exemptions are under the law. But in some ways, it's actually in my experience, it's less about that and more about using the optics to your advantage. And so telling districts point blank, hey, I'm going to say in my story that you didn't give me records that you have the discretion to give me. I need a statement from you as to why. And asking for a request for comment like that um, at that sort of mid stage of when I've been denied, in many cases, completely changed the trajectory of the request. It went from a denial to hang on, wait, let me see what we can give you. And so it shouldn't be that way. Again, these documents, in most cases, again, particularly cases where the underlying behavior involves student safety, where an investigation has been substantiated. A lot of times these records are public, but you still have to fight to get them. And I see Mike, yeah, thank you, Mike, for that link in the chat there to the SPLC's letter generator. It's a fantastic resource. I still use it. I've been reporting now for 17 years, and I use that letter generator when I'm in a state that I don't know the law very well. So it's a great resource. Um, so let's go to other types of sources. So again, I kind of talked about some of these already, but social media is a huge one. Again, Facebook for me was immensely helpful in terms of triangulating sources. So, one thing that you should keep in mind, and again, some of you probably already know this, this might sound obvious, but if you are successful in getting the public records from a teacher's disciplinary file, typically the names of the students involved in a case should be redacted, right? That's that redaction makes sense, right? That FERPA and the privacy of the student are important, obviously. And so you're not going to know, even if you get a stack of records, you're not going to necessarily know who the student involved was. And so for me, one of the primary ways around that was social media, Facebook, and just triaging with all the sources that I could talk to. That, hey, this student graduated in this year. They were in this class. Do you have any idea who they might be? And sort of involving everyone that I could in my my own quest, my reporting quest, to find people so that I could talk to them, so that I could give them a heads up and say, hey, you know, like in this case, for example, you see the document on your screen. This is a teacher named Mike Sullivan. Um, these students, I wasn't able to speak with all of these students, but I wanted to try to reach all of them so I could say, hey, I'm probably going to publish this document. I'm writing a story. It's going to name this teacher, and I want you to know, so that you're aware of it. And obviously, I want to interview them as well. But at a minimum, I want them to know. Um, and so, yeah, social media and using people that you've already gained as a source to help you get more is huge. In one case, actually, not this exact document, but a different document with this particular teacher who passed away several years ago. One of the students that I wasn't able to reach actually called me after the story, and she said, "Hey, I recognize my handwriting," um, and I had no idea that the school. This was back in the '90s. This person's in her 40s, and she said, "I have no idea that the school didn't take my complaint seriously." And she was floored by that. And so, the records you get, I can't emphasize enough like how impactful they can be for people, not just your readers and your story to give it authority, which we'll talk about, but also for the people involved behind the scenes too. Um, Yearbooks. So yearbooks is a huge resource. Again, for me, I often turn to yearbooks to identify sources and to get breadcrumbs too, frankly. At my high school, at least, there were, gosh, countless cases where teachers were doing or saying inappropriate things in yearbooks. Things that perhaps uh, would have more easily gone over in the 80s or 90s, for example. And so having that historical record was helpful. It was great, obviously, for photos. I showed you a couple slides ago. So this timeline here on the right of your screen, all of these are yearbook photos that I took, and so of teachers who had abused or harassed students. And so it was great to put names to faces, right? Yearbooks are hugely valuable and generally, again, public. Um, Often the local library will have copies of the yearbook for that local school. In some cases, going back decades. So yearbooks are a great resource. Um, Finding a gatekeeper or a Sherpa. This is critical with any kind of reporting, right? Again, let's go back to that castle. You're on the outside. Who's the gatekeeper that's going to let you in? In my case, I'd say a lot of those people were uh, alumni and employees, current and former, people who had witnessed some of those breadcrumb type behaviors, breadcrumbs in quotes here, and either spoke up about it and nothing was done, or regretted not speaking up about it, and were in many cases literally like waiting for a reporter like me to call them. Again, going back to what I said at the beginning, like this kind of abuse, it might sound crazy, but it's incredibly common. And so, often at a school, right? A school is a pretty insular institution, right? Everybody's kind of up in everyone's business, right? It's small. Everyone kind of knows each other, even at a big high school, right? Um, that's typically the case. And so leveraging that with your reporting by talking to people can really go a long way. Putting the word out. So you can do this, these days, right? Kind of a variety of ways. We at Business Insider published, call out when I did the nationwide story and asked people if they had experienced a case where they were groomed by a teacher or know someone who was, to call me. And we just put my cell phone out there, and my email. And I get a lot of spam. I always have, but I also got a lot of tips that way. People who, I probably wouldn't have found on my own. People in places where I had zero sources or context, right? And so just putting the word out that you're interested, that can be a public call out. It can be a semi-public call out on, again, social media. Maybe it's a Facebook group of alumni. Pop in and say, "Hey, I'm so and so. I'm a reporter. I'm interested in this issue, and I would love to talk to people. DM me privately." Um, can be a really, really fruitful exercise. Um, so corroborating claims. So this is huge in any kind of investigative reporting, particularly this kind of reporting. I think because it involves a deep sense of trust with people who have had that trust violated. So it's really important to keep in mind that with child sexual abuse and grooming in particular, it's predicated on manipulation and emotional and mental manipulation before physical behavior. And so, often students who are targeted for this kind of abuse would consider, even after they've been abused, the teacher to be an ally, to be a friend, to be a mentor, to be a parent figure. These are all phrases that I've heard people describe to me for people who hurt them terribly. And there's a lot to unpack there, right? In terms of trust, in terms of um, just the longstanding damage that this behavior can have on people. And so, it's not going to be in most cases. Sometimes it is, but in most cases, it's not going to be the first phone call when you finally reached that source, right? You've combed through the yearbooks and social media, and you've asked 10 people, say, "Hey, what year did she graduate? Oh my gosh, I finally got to her." It's probably not going to be the first call that she just opens up about exactly what happened. And so patience, I think, is a really important trait with this kind of reporting. And being really transparent is super important. I think there's sometimes a misconception with Me Too stories in general that, a victim of this kind of behavior is looking for sympathy in some way, shoulder to kind of lean on. In my experience, that's usually not the case. Usually, what these people are looking for is to be taken seriously, to be heard, to be seen. Um, and there's a difference in that, right? In being empathetic versus sympathetic. And I have at the end a link, but the Dart Center is a phenomenal resource for this. Again, for me as a business reporter, primarily, I didn't really have much experience in this, and so I leaned on the Dart Center and other colleagues who had done Me Too stories a lot early on when I was reporting this to figure out, how should I approach these interviews? What should I be looking for? How can I gauge the trustworthiness of a source? How can I get sources to trust me? Um, and these were some of the things that worked the best for me. Obviously, what works great for one reporter may not work as well for another, but these are things that worked really well for me. Being transparent, saying, "Hey," I'll give you an example of someone I wrote about in this story. Clara was one of the students I wrote about. And when I first reached Clara, it was through all that triangulation, right? Through, I think, a sibling and a former classmate and right, seven other things. And when I finally reached her, I said, "Hey, this is what I've heard. I've heard that you had a sexual relationship with this teacher. I've heard it from a couple people. I don't know if it's true, but I really want to talk to you about it." Um, and Clara blew me off. She said, "No, that's not true. I could understand why you might have heard that," which, I'm on the phone with her. For me, I thought that was kind of weird. Like, wait, it's not true, but you understand why I would have heard that? What does that mean? Um, I didn't know at the time, but these breadcrumbs, right, that were obvious in her case that I wrote about. But she said, "No, didn't happen, and best of luck," essentially. Um, it wasn't until several months later, when she had sort of had the time to process what happened, when she had taken various steps in her own life to talk to people that she had never told about what happened to her, that she was sort of ready to talk to me. And by me just sort of being available and saying, "Hey, I really appreciate that. If you ever want to talk, later on, I could tell you more other cases that I'm looking at, for example, and why I'm doing this." That was something that, for a lot of people, they wanted to know, like, why are you investing so much time in this and being transparent in that? And for me, the answer is pretty simple and I think pretty relatable, and that is that it became very apparent to me that this kind of behavior, at least at my high school, and later when I looked at this nationwide, is so common, and that you had actually in some cases generations of students. I had mothers and daughters both being abused at the same school, and when learned that and corroborated that, it really just clicked in my head, like, gosh, like this is this cycle, and the only way this cycle is going to stop, the cycle of abuse, is if we put out there exactly what happened. And so I was very upfront with folks, like, hey, this is why I'm doing this, because I think these are important stories that need to get out there if we're going to have any hope of this cycle actually ending. And people, I think, responded to that pretty positively. This is an example of a text message that my teacher sent a former student. Um, So, okay, so you have some breadcrumbs. How are you going to actually verify those breadcrumbs, right? Um, Again, like, who might have been in the room? So this document to the right is an example of well, as you can see, the title, sexual harassment initial report. It's from a teacher's personnel file. This is one of the documents, like that one a few slides ago with Mike Sullivan, that my school district refused to release to me for years. It wasn't until I actually sued the school uh, uh, for violating the Public Records Act here in California that I got records like this. And I think it's probably, I mean, I don't know. I don't know for certain why the school district didn't release these records, but I think it's, you can kind of put two and two together in terms of the optics, right? Going back to the optics of your reporting, why documents like this may not look great for the school. In this case, I don't know. I didn't know who the student was, right? This was a long time ago. This was, I think it says, yeah, May 23rd, 2000. I didn't know who this student was, but I knew a lot about this teacher, and I knew people who were in his class around those years. Um, and so asking, other sources I had, and in many cases, just showing them this document, like, hey, does this seem plausible to you? The as you can see, the name of the student is redacted. So this is a document that I felt comfortable with showing other people and saying, hey, what do you make of this? Like, this seems kind of wild. Like, he would just say this in class like this, like to essentially DM, an early DM, as we would say today, of a student, um, and asking everyone I could about it. Also, again, I know I mentioned this a couple times already, but other types of records. So once I had sources who had direct experiences with this teacher, and then I got these personnel files, I then shifted gears my reporting to other contemporaneous records, asking folks for diaries, text messages, yearbooks, letters, phone call logs. All of those things are types of records that in most cases are probably not going to be available to you in that first phone call, right? This is after weeks, or in many cases months, of trust building with the source that they're then willing to turn this stuff over. But you can get there, and it's all predicated on earning that person's trust. Um, so I think, yeah, we're doing okay on time. Just a reminder too for folks, if you have questions, please, yeah, fire away, and we can take them. You don't have to save them for the end. Um, So navigating interviews, right? This is obviously it can be a really tricky component of stories like this. It can be tricky for education reporters just doing any education story, right? Talking to children. And so in most cases where a student has been groomed for a sexual relationship, they don't come forward right away. Typically, they come forward years later. Sometimes it's just a couple years, and they kind of realize and can process what happened. In some cases, it's decades later. Many of the people that I interviewed for the Predators Playground for this piece, were in their 40s by the time I spoke with them and they were willing to come forward. So, um, again, I just want to underscore like you're in a lot of cases asking people to unpack a really difficult thing that they've kept buried on purpose, right? And so it's going to be a really heavy thing. A lot of my initial interviews with folks were really less like interviews and more just a conversation. It wasn't a fact finding interview so much for me as a just kind of get to know you interview. And there were definitely aspects of these conversations as they evolved for many months that felt almost like a therapy session. And for me, it was like, oh my God, like I'm totally ill-equipped. I'm not a therapist. I have no training to do those. But for me, it sort of felt when a source would want to really, spend hours on the phone talking about something, to a degree, I've asked them to go into this world with me to help me. I kind of owe it to them in a way to have those hard conversations. And so I spoke with child therapists and sexual abuse experts about how to navigate these conversations. Not journalists. I'd already talked to reporters who had reported on this and got a feel for that. Knew what I was supposed to do as my job, but I wanted to really talk to subject area experts as well. And I would definitely encourage you all to do the same if you think you really want to dive headfirst into this. Um, yeah, I think a lot of these are probably self-explanatory, but just listening obviously is huge. Staying focused on accountability. So, even when I would have these interviews that would kind of veer into de facto therapy sessions, for me, when we're really in the weeds on something, I would ask the person um, about specific questions that I had about accountability for the teacher. Like, okay, so you told your friend, who do you think they told? Or, did any adults know? And when the school did investigate, did they ever talk to you? And a lot of my questions were told from that end. And so it was about creating the space for them to share what happened. And then for me, asking the questions through that accountability lens. And that would help often give some structure to for the source as well. I'm not um, being typically like super aggressive about how I'm going to ask those questions, right? It's not like I would be maybe if I was talking to the superintendent or the head of HR. Those are it's a very different kind of interview. Um, but letting the source know, letting the survivor know that this is how I'm thinking about it as the journalist, right? That's my job to think about it from an accountability standpoint. And then, like I said before, it's not about sympathy; it's about wanting to be taken seriously. Um, so showing your work, documents are can mean a lot of things. These are a few examples of the kinds of records that, again, this is now we've moved beyond the personnel file records. I've already gotten those, the public documents, right? You can do a story just with those documents. Like there's um, nothing wrong with that. And in fact, those stories, I would say the bulk of Me Too stories in schools are based on just those documents. And that's can be really, really rich reporting and is a huge public service. If you want to go deeper, if you want to tell sort of less the what happened and more the why, you're going to need some non-public documents, contemporaneous records, right? And so those ones I talked about, text messages. Um, this text message on the left is an example of two students talking about a teacher and a relationship, or excuse me, a coach and a relationship that he had with a student. And then the image on the right, the Lego, is an example of a gift that a teacher, actually, again, also a coach, gave a student when she was in his class. And so these are photos, screenshots of records that can really add depth. Okay, we already know that this coach abused this student. I've established that, but I want to make the reader care. I want this to land, right? I want this story to hit like a ton of bricks. And I think if you read The Predator's Playground, it's a very heavy read. A lot of the feedback we got from it was like, oh my God, like I read that story and like I had to like stop work. Like I had to call in sick. I couldn't, it was just so much to process. And that was a very intentional decision on our part. We wanted to sort of show for the reader what it's like to experience this, what it's like to be in a community where this is common. And so we really place a high bar on getting records like this. And it all comes again from that position of trust that you can establish with the source. Um, Again, other types of screenshots here. So these are social media. I think Instagram messages that a teacher I wrote about had sent to students. I think they probably kind of speak for themselves. Um, and electronic communication in general. Obviously, this I think this is probably assumed, right? It's 2025, but students are always online, and a lot of the grooming behavior, a lot of these breadcrumbs, particularly during COVID, when I was doing a lot of this reporting, is digital. And so really focusing your efforts on social media, on other places where students and teachers are interacting electronically, email, etc. This is kind of a subtle one, I think, but I wanted to raise it. I think it's a really important point. You need to remember who else needs to be held accountable. So obviously, there are the teachers who do this behavior, which I should point out, as common as it is, and I'll pull up here in a second when we finish these slides, a nationwide story I did to give you a feel for that. As common as it is, it's less than 1% of teachers are doing this. It's just that we have so many teachers in this country that less than 1% is still a lot, right? But that teacher who's doing this behavior, that's just one of the characters who needs to be held accountable, right? There's also the institution, and there's also the others, the other mandated reporters. And so on the left here of your screen, you see this is a GChat exchange that I got via public records request. Um, this I got via public records request, I should point out, because I had a very targeted um, keyword, which was a news article that I wrote. So the first article I did about my high school journalism teacher, everyone on campus was talking about it. It went viral. 9 million people read that story, and almost everyone on campus read the story. And so I knew that people were talking about it. And so I asked for all emails and communications that included a link to that story. And this is one of the records that came back. Let's give you a second to read it, and so I can drink some tea. So these are two teachers, Linda Rosales and Brian Aliff, who were talking about what was known broadly on campus about this other teacher, Alex Rye, this guy, in these screenshots. Um, Nothing was done because no crime was committed. Um, so, this was an example of a theme that came up again and again in reporting the story, The Predator's Playground, which is, okay, who else was aware of these breadcrumbs? Who else failed to do their job in reporting this behavior? And that really spoke to the culture and the norms. So again, we've moved past the what happened, and now we're firmly into the why it happened. Um, and so would really encourage you again, you can do a story without holding the other mandated reporters accountable, and that's a fine story. I think a better story is to hold the teachers accountable and all those around them for their role in enabling a situation, enabling a culture where this behavior is tolerated. Um, so, the story, in my case, it did have a lot of impact, as Mike mentioned. Um, this was the date, I don't remember the date on this. I think this was about a year ago. This story, there's now been 5 civil lawsuits that I know of. There may be others against my high school, brought by people, many of whom I wrote about, but also folks I didn't write about who I didn't even know their stories, who are suing the school, all essentially alleging the same thing, which is that the school failed, and the district rather failed to protect them from abusive teachers. And then more recently, this was back in October of last year, so about 6 months ago, the California Attorney General's office opened a rare investigation of a K-12 school. So the AG's office has a division that focuses on civil rights. types of violations, civil litigation, obviously. And this is, as far as I know, the second K-12 school district that office has investigated. Another one, if you want to look it up for context, and also some incredible reporting in the Redland School District, also in Southern California, that a couple of reporters spent a lot of time on as well. Um, but just to show you, the all of that work and the hurdles that you can encounter can lead to some pretty big change. Um, this is another subtle thing that probably applies, frankly, in my situation more than it might for yours, unless you also report on your high school, which I can't say I would recommend, to be perfectly frank. It can be fraught, and in many cases more difficult than you might think. Um, but even if you're reporting on the school district that you're assigned to cover as an education reporter, it's not typically the kind of reporting you can just sort of dip in and out of. Again, you're kind of poking at these wounds that in many cases were ignored or never healed to begin with, were decades old. And when you poke at that and you write about that, you investigate that, you're kind of opening a whole Pandora's box in a way of other fallout that can happen. This story that I published, The Predator's Playground, changed people's relationships, led to all sorts of behind the scenes impact. Teachers being forced out, teachers being fired, um, people dumping their boyfriend, all sorts of things that I found out about afterwards, um, that the community, is still in some ways kind of like, processing. And so if you write a story about one of these insular institutions, particularly I think at the K-12 level, right, where a school district is really kind of its own fiefdom in a way, meaning what happens in mine has almost no bearing on what happens in yours and vice versa. Um, when you do that, you're going to have real impact. Now, whether it's like the kind of impact that you can measure, is it going to be a state AG's investigation? Maybe not, possibly. But there are going to be a lot of other things, a million little things behind the scenes that can happen as well. And so, when you bring this stuff to light, I think, you have a duty to kind of hear people out, to take those phone calls 2, 3, 6 months, a year later. I got a call last week from somebody who wanted to ask me something, and I haven't thought about that teacher in over a year, and I'm going to take that phone call. And so I just think you kind of owe it to people when you really dive into a story like this to do that. Um, so yeah, I would love to hear your questions. Like I said, at the top, for this, I can also show you, I'm going to take a break to see if people do have questions, and then I can show you as well, a little bit more of a nationwide lens. I don't know if Mike or Josh, I know you mentioned you had a couple beforehand as well. Maybe do you want to start with that?
Yeah, Matt, that was so good. Oh, I've written down a bunch of questions, written down a bunch of notes for myself. So thank you very much for that. Very inspirational. Like you said, this is a story that deserves coverage, deserves attention. Um, so, like I said, I have some questions, but I know one of the questions that was in the that was asked before we started. Do you have any special tips for private school student journalists trying to, get into their private schools where you can't use open records laws typically?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is really tricky, as you might guess. It's not it's not any easier, I don't think. I think with private schools, instead of public records from the school district, your best bet for public records is typically going to be litigation or law enforcement records. Um, which we didn't talk a ton about in this presentation because it wasn't as pertinent in my case, but I certainly have a lot of experience with both of those things. A lot of the cases that I'm familiar with and I've read with private school abuse can often come out and really have the floodgates open with a court case when someone comes forward. Um, and so to, be very diligent about searching not just your local area, but maybe somewhere else where a court case might have been brought. Um, could be civil or criminal too, so teachers can and often are investigated criminally for this behavior. And so if you have names that you suspect, in my case, I mentioned I started with a hunch of just, hey, I wonder if there could be someone like this. I'd read a story by a reporter friend of mine called Benefit of the Doubt, about a public school in Oregon, and a PE teacher who always got the benefit of the doubt. And I read that story and I just had this feeling of like, gosh, I wonder, is there someone like that at my high school? And I kind of came to a list of, I think it was maybe 5 or 6 teachers where I had a suspicion, or I'd heard a tip, or I had seen something when I was a student. In my case, I had that advantage, right, of my own eyewitness memories, and asking for documents from the school on those folks. If it's a private school, running those names through a court record search, through your local police department, things like that. But yeah, it's certainly tougher with the private school. I will say, there are some private schools though that will, if asked, turn over documents, and you know perhaps see the value in being transparent about this. So there's nothing preventing a private school from releasing a record, right? Typically they're not,
Right.
but you're not going to get that answer if you don't ask. So I would still ask. It's not a public records request, but I would still ask the district for any records, and in some cases, you might get some records back. Because
Yeah.
the other thing to keep in mind is like there are it can often be gray, but there are cases where the school wants nothing to do with the teacher, and so they might not have the incentives that you might assume to protect the reputation of that teacher. And so there might be cases where a private school would say, "Yeah, we investigated this person for this, and we found that, and here you go."
Cool. Well, thank you. Yeah. Josh, I don't know if there's any questions that have come in during the talk today. If not, I still have some questions I want to get to.
I don't think so.
Okay. Okay. One big question I have is, you know, the folks that I work with, student journalists that I work with, that this is not their full-time job. Obviously, they're students, full-time, or they've got other full-time jobs and things. And so, I think, if nothing else, one of the things I think that folks are going to take away from your talk today is this is hard work. I mean, this is not, like you said, this is not something you jump into part-time and you leave, quickly. This is something that sticks with you for a while. Um, Particularly, maybe for high school, for any student journalist. I mean, how would you feel? One of the things I've suggested is, this story is bigger than you're ready to take on. It's still a story that's worth being told. Would you, how about reaching out to local media, to local working journalists to let them know, this is the information that's come to me. This is what I have. I mean, would you ever be interested, or would any of your colleagues ever be interested in doing kind of a partnership, not particularly formal partnership, but some sort of deal where you're working together?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think those types of collaborations are increasingly common, which I think is a good thing. At Business Insider, I don't know that we would be the natural outlet for it, just because
Yeah.
this is sort of the exception to us. We don't typically cover education. We probably wouldn't have, had we not had, wouldn't have covered it in this way, this really in-depth way, if we didn't have the intense reader response to that first article about my high school teacher. Um, but I think those collaborations are very common, and I think that's can certainly be a fine way to do it. I also think that even if you may not be ready to, interview survivors and to comb over law enforcement records and to sue your high school district, right? Like, a lot of things that you're probably not going to just do tomorrow. I do think requesting and obtaining some records can still be worthwhile, and can prompt a lot of questions behind the scenes too. That's another thing that, even as a student reporter, you may not realize, but when you are asking uncomfortable questions, even if you're not getting answers to those questions, just by you asking them, can be having some impact behind the scenes about, wait, what is the student asking about? And what did we do with that teacher? And did we properly investigate? And, oh, I guess we did have sign a settlement agreement with them. Oh, and I guess that does include an NDA, huh? Like, just by you asking questions and trying to get even that top level disciplinary document, I think is something that student journalists can and should do. A lot of the other things that I talked about, maybe you're not ready for, maybe you are. But I do think, at least for that requesting records, or if it's a private school, seeing if records exist, can be worthwhile.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, as student journalists, I mean, we're on the front lines. I mean, we know we have access to information that's going to be, more difficult for somebody that's coming in from the outside. And so, I really do, yeah, encourage students to, yeah, to, like you said, to at least push forward, and see what you can get, and then make decisions about going forward. Um,
Absolutely.
let's see where we are with time here. So, my big job with the to reporting has been to do a lot of pre-publication review. So, you've done all the stuff about, getting the documents, you found the breadcrumbs and put all the sourcing together, and you've written your story. I'd just be interested how much you relied on kind of pre-publication review. It just seems to me that, I mean, I tell all the students that you need a second or a third pair of eyes on these stories. This is journalism. You really just shouldn't be doing alone. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear uh, what your process was like, and yeah, what you any suggestions.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Mike, that this kind of story absolutely needs legal review. The short of it for folks. And I see Andrea in the chat here, one of my colleagues at Cal Poly Humboldt, who teaches media law up there. The short of it, not to get too far down the media law rabbit hole, but is that it's arguable if a public teacher is a public figure. And so that you have a much higher bar there in terms of, or excuse me, a much lower bar in terms of the subject of your reporting suing you. And so for defamation, and that type of thing. So you definitely want legal review. In my case, I'm very fortunate to be a business insider where we have a trio of in-house attorneys who all looked at this and offered many suggestions and suggested changes that helped strengthen the story. And I think, for me, going into those conversations with them, all of the evidence, I showed you some of the examples, some of the screenshots, was really what gave them comfort that we had it right, right? The best defense to a lawsuit is being accurate. And so a lot of those contemporaneous records and why we went the extra mile to go and do all of that was so that by the time we got to the legal review, it wasn't just, well, I've talked to this former student and a couple of their friends said that what she said is true. Like, maybe that's enough, but often it's not. And so having as much information as possible before that conversation is what made those conversations go as smoothly as they could.
So good. Yeah. I mean, some of the toughest conversations that I've had as a lawyer is, when the reporter comes to me and they've got the story. I mean, they just know it's true. But then when you start kind of digging in a little bit, what do you have to back that up other than just, you're knowing it's true? It can be difficult. And, just say that we're just not there yet to a journalist that's been working on this and believes in this and really wants to tell the story. Can be a difficult conversation. But yeah, these are
Right.
stories that you can't mess up. I mean, there's really not a lot of wiggle room for error here. So,
And I would say if you do find yourself in that situation, you can't publish the story. It's you can't publish it right now. It's
yes,
not ever. And so, to go back, sometimes going back to your sources with that, hey, my editor says I can't do this if I don't have this. My lawyer won't let me do this if I don't have that. Um, can often net more information.
yeah.
And so, it's in investigative reporting in particular, it's a no is almost never a no forever. It's just a no right now.
And
Keep that
sometimes
in mind.
stories that even if you can't use names and other, get into the nitty gritty, there are great examples. I mean, if you clean it up and scrub it down, it could be a great example of what students are dealing with on campus and stuff. So, did Andre have a question here? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah. What are the first steps when a student journalist gets a tip? Do you record initial meetings? What do you tell the source survivor to be realistic about expectations? So, yeah, thank you, Andrea. I think, first steps when you get a tip, I think, are, getting any, like I talked about at the beginning, just getting any kind of documents that you can from the institution. Um, Interviewing the people involved. I went to the teachers that I wrote about in this story pretty early on, and said, "Hey, this is what I'm working on. I've heard this or that, and I'd like to speak with you." And in some cases, I got interviews that way early on before I knew everything that I would know about this person way before. And then later, when I came to them for the, final, like, hey, it's me again, however many months have elapsed since our last conversation, and we're getting ready to publish this story. Sometimes that elicited a phone call from their attorney or just an emailed response or no comment. Some of the most candid stuff that I got was by calling teachers early on. And so I think, you know, uh, being cognizant of that is a really important thing. I do not record most of my interviews. I'm in California. It's a two-party consent state. I I do record interviews occasionally. It's really for me, it's more of a practical matter where um, I don't have time to transcribe something. I know, and I tell my students this actually, that you take way too many verbatim notes. Like you way too many. You do not need as many verbatim notes as you think you do, i.e., a transcript. Most of my notes are facts that this person is telling me in the interview, things that I'm going to go check later. And so it's a lot of notes like to myself, like they said this happened on this date. Uh, Go look at that later. I don't need to know the exact quote of what they said for that. And when I hear a great quote, I know it when I hear it. Now, obviously, that's a little trickier when you're just starting out, to know a great quote when you hear it. But I still actually think that a lot of people, you have an ear for, you know, I've been talking at you now for 50 minutes. Like there are a couple things hopefully that you heard that like maybe you wrote down that that's a good quote, but you're not going to quote the vast majority of what I just told you. And so I don't record interviews mostly from a practical matter, and also knowing that when it comes time to publish, when it comes time to talk to my attorneys before I publish, having those verbatim quotes isn't going to get me over the finish line. It's going to be all of that evidence that I found. And so the quotes aren't actually that helpful for me. So a lot of investigative reporting quotes are not as helpful as they are for like a daily story, for example. And then what do you tell the source survivor to be realistic? Yeah, that's a really tough one. It's a good question. I think, up front, I really emphasize that I want to hear what they have to share, even if it's off the record. And I offer anonymity and an off the record conversation pretty quickly, I would say, in a situation like this. We're talking about sexual abuse in children. It's obviously a lot of reporting on that is without a full name for a reason. Um, and so this particular context, I'm pretty quick to give that. But also in other contexts, as an investigative reporter, I'm pretty quick to give it. And the reason I give anonymity up front is it's really a bet on myself that I can win the trust of this person eventually. Probably not right away because trust, right, comes with time. You don't trust someone the second you meet them, most likely. You shouldn't. And so it's a bet on myself that I can win this person over, and I can either A, convince them to go on the record later, great, or B, even if I don't, that information, what I can glean from them, can maybe lead me to other documents, to other sources, to a whole universe of useful things to know. Um, so I offer anonymity, particularly for survivors, pretty upfront. And in terms of being realistic and what I tell them, I just say like, look, this is what I'm working on. This is why I'm doing it, right? So in my case, I got to a certain point and it was like, hey, this seems like a generational cycle. Like, you know, a reasonable person would say that cycle needs to stop. This is why I'm doing it, and being very transparent about that, um, and just telling them I think that they can contribute to that in some way. That doesn't mean that their photo is going to be on the story and they're going to be the lead of the story. It just means they can help me understand that and better inform that. And so letting this person know that they're a stakeholder, like they're a part of this, and I'm gonna go, I'm gonna hold your hand. We're going to go on this journey. And that journey may just be that one conversation. It may be a many months later, a relationship that goes on. But they're with me. They're going to help me. And you're really instilling a sense of you, the source, can help this greater good. That's what I want to convey to them. It's not that I'm going to quote you. It's not that I'm going to write about you. It's that you can help me do something that's really important.
That's terrific. Matt, I think we're probably at time here. Thank you so much. This has really been a wonderful conversation, and I know it's going to be useful to a lot of the folks that I talk with. I think that it'll be shown in lots of newsrooms across the country as students, get into this topic. So thank you very, very much. We're very grateful, and yeah, thank you for being here during Sunshine Week 2025. So
Absolutely. Happy to celebrate this with you all. And if you have questions, feel free to drop me a line. I'm really easy to find on the internet. Matt Drange, you can find me anywhere you are. I'm probably there. And I'd be happy to help you if I can.
perfect. And I know we're going to package this up and put it online, so we'll have lots of line notes and things like that at the bottom. So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us. We'll talk to you next time.